Okay, so hi everyone, and good afternoon and good morning for those who are in different time zones. So in this session, we are going to talk about mainly about Android-related changes, specifically Android 12 and 13. Obviously, we are not going to have very much time to discuss about all the changes that have been introduced in these two versions. So we are going to limit ourselves only on the most important ones. So I would just say a disclaimer in this moment and say that we are still going to I'm actually going still to release two articles on the developer portal, on the Zebra developers portal. So keep an eye on the portal in the coming weeks as I'm going to release two articles fully dedicated on the Android 12 and also Android 13 changes in case you want to dive more into specific changes. Okay, so with this out of the way, let's get into the main features. We are going to start with the features. So first of all, so we will discuss about Material U, obviously. So Material U, in case you haven't heard about it, is the third major iteration of material design, and it has been introduced in Android 12. So with Material U, we have a new design language, updated themes, also new components which you can use inside your application. And at the same time, we have the introduction of many different colors which have been missing in the previous releases. We can also expect to have a greater emphasis on using the entire screen, I mean the available screen of the devices. So in that case, we can expect a greater support also for tablets and also for the screens as well. And in terms of development, I mean, developers can already start to experiment and work with the new upgraded dependencies. So, for instance, if you upgrade the Material U, the material design library inside any of your Android projects to the version 1.5.0, you can already start to use these new updated components and themes from Material U. And you can obviously do that in any emulator running Android 12 or 13. And at the same time, we also have migration and components related documentation in case you want to check out more in specific the changes in the changes which have been made with Material U. Now, going forward, still on Android 12, we have another important change which is related to the splash screen. So we all know about splash screens. We are all using them for different purposes inside our applications. But what you need to know is that from Android 12, splash screens are like by default now. So any applications which previously on Android 11 didn't have any splash screens, they do have now one, which is kind of like a plain white with the icon in the center of it, whenever you open the application. And at the same time, Google has stated basically that customized splash screens are now considered as bad practice, essentially. So whenever you going to use customized splash screen to load specific logic data every time you open your application, that's going to be considered now as bad practice. And for instance, if you try to create any splash screen inside Android Studio, there's actually going to be a warning for that as well. So essentially what's changing now for splash screen is that you're only going to have the ability to change the appearance of this splash screen, which is going to, like I said, is going to be by default now. And you can do that by using the splash screen APIs that Google has been put at your disposal. And if you give a look at the on the right side of the slide, you can actually see that there is a composition happening here on how the splash screen is being shown. So we have 4 main components, and all those 4 main components can be changed, but that's just for appearance, so it's nothing related to actual logic, so it's just for appearance. Now, in terms of enterprise speaking, this change should not impact that much developers working on enterprise applications, because obviously we use splash screens for, like I said, different reasons, and we need them. We still need them to perform specific operations before jumping to the main screen of the application. So just keep in mind that this change has been made. So keep an eye for future references for future releases of Android. Now, going to Android 13 now, we have an interesting change here about the introduction of a task manager, which has been made for foreground services. So essentially, there's going to be now a fully dedicated task manager for foreground services, which is going to show not just the foreground services being run at the moment, but applications which are being run at the moment. So all the applications are going to be visible in this list, regardless of the targeted SDK version. But at the same time, there are going to be some exemptions, and we are going to check them out in a minute. What you need to understand from this is that whenever an application is going to be killed, or I mean stopped from this task manager, the application is not going to receive any callbacks or any notification, so you will not know whether your application has been terminated from the task manager. And whenever the application is going to be terminated, not just the foreground service is going to be terminated, but like the entire application. So, and another thing to consider here is that whenever a foreground service is going to run for more than 20 hours, for instance, there's going to be a system notification warning the user that there is this application consuming, I mean, there's this application running a foreground service for large period of time. So you should check it from the task manager. Now, in terms of exemptions, there are some applications which are not going to be visible in this list, or there are going to be applications visible but not being able to be terminated. So in the first group, we have from applications not showing at all in the list. We have applications which are in demo mode, for instance. We have system level applications, so the system applications are not going to be visible at all in this task manager. And then we also have safety applications with the emergency role in place. Now, in the second category, when we have applications visible in the task manager but not from being able to stop, but from being stopped by the user, we have the device owner applications, profile owner based applications. We also have persistent applications, and also applications which have the role dialer role in place, so like the phone application, for instance. Now, last interesting feature which I wanted to talk about is the app language. So I don't know if you ever had the chance to work with locals or multiple languages in your application, but previously it was kind of a mess in the previous Android versions, because there wasn't any like official support to handle multiple locals in your application. And at the same time, the end user didn't have any possibility to customize for each application a specific language. So for instance, now with Android 13, you can actually have your phone in English, for instance, and you can actually change the app language for a specific application with another one, as long as that application supports that your preferred language. And on the development side, it's going to be even easier now to specify which languages your application is supporting. And on top of that, you're also going to have the ability to change now dynamically the language directly from your application. So, I mean, programmatically, I mean. So for the developers, what you need to do is add this little attribute about in the Android manifest in the application block. So Android local config, and then you will pass the XML containing the locals that your application is supporting. And if you want to change anytime the language dynamically from your application, you will then use the set application locals from the app compat delegate class. And here we have also the examples with the XML on the top with the available locals and the format. And then we also have to the bottom, we have an example like how you can use the set application locals method. Now, going forward and jumping on the permissions changes, we had a couple of interesting changes, both on Android 12 and 13. So starting with Android 12, we had the introduction of a new set of Bluetooth permissions. And essentially now we are going to have for each Bluetooth use case a specific permission, and we have 3 of them. So the first one, which is the Bluetooth scan, is going to be used whenever we want to look out and scan for Bluetooth devices nearby. Then the second one, which is the Bluetooth advertise, is going to be used whenever we want to make our device discoverable for other devices. And lastly, the third one, the Bluetooth Connect, is going to be used whenever we want to connect our device to another paired up Bluetooth one. So these all 3 are going to be runtime permissions. So you will have to request the permissions in a normal way, and the user will have to accept them. And there are also 2 things to consider here. So you are still going to, you will still have to support the old legacy Bluetooth permissions, because those are still needed for the previous Android versions. But the only thing that you have to change in the Android manifest will be to add the Max SDK version with the number 30, indicating the Android 11 API level, so that the operating system will understand that this permission should only be considered until Android 11. And the second thing to consider here is something related about the access file location permission. So the access file location is the permission used for the precise location of the user. So previously in the previous Android versions, you had to use the access file location to determine the physical location of the Bluetooth devices if you wanted to scan. But now, since we have the Bluetooth scan permission, and which is going to scan for you for Bluetooth devices nearby without using the physical location of devices, you can just discard the access file location in your project and use only the Bluetooth scan. But In case you still need the access file location for other purposes in your application, keep it, but keep in mind that it is no longer needed in case you want to search for Bluetooth devices. And lastly, here we have another example with the Android manifest and how it could look like with the new Bluetooth permissions. Now, continuing with the access file location, there is a change related to this permission as well. And essentially, starting with Android 12, it is no longer possible to request this permission standalone, I mean. So the operating system now requires you to, whenever you want to perform a request for the access file location, to specify also the coarse location. So the coarse location permission is the permission related to the approximate location of the device. And this essentially was made because there wasn't any, you basically didn't give the ability to the user to choose between the precise and the approximate location. So that's now mandatory. And starting with Android 13, essentially the operating system will just ignore your request if you try to request only the access file location. So your request should look like something like in the very right corner, so here basically. Now, going on Android 13 now, we have the introduction of a very, very new permission, which is related to the notifications. So essentially now the user would have the ability to deny incoming notifications for any application, and that's going to include also high fidelity ones. So I mean, the application will don't have any, would not be able to show you any notifications if you are going to deny the permission. So this permission is called post notification, and it's going to be a runtime permission, so same as the others. And how it will work? Well, basically, it will work like going the system settings and disabling the notifications for a specific application. So it's going to be the same logic, but this time the application will have to request this permission before sending any notifications to the user. Now, staying on Android 13, we have some little changes to storage permissions as well. And essentially, the read external storage permission has been now deprecated. So even if you include this permission, it's not going to do anything from Android, starting with Android 13. And instead, if you want to use any if you want to access any media files, for example, you will have to use one of these new granular media permissions. So like the read media image, read media video, and the read media audio. And all of these are going to be runtime permissions as well. So you will have to request them in the typical way. Now, last change about permissions is related to the Wi-Fi use cases. So starting with Android 13, Google has continued to limit the usage of the access file location, basically. So previously on other versions, you had to use the access file location also for a couple of Wi-Fi use cases, essentially. So this has been limited now also for those cases, and a new proper permission has been created only for these usages. And this is called the nearby Wi-Fi devices permission. And also this permission is going to be a runtime one. So the user will have to accept this permission. And among the use cases that this permission is going to include, you can find the the ones like find or connect to nearby devices, such as printers or media casting ones. You can also initiate a connection to a known SSID, start a local-only hotspot, or even check the range of nearby Wi-Fi aware devices. Now, let's get into some miscellaneous changes. So here we have some little changes on toasts. So toasts have received some little updates in Android 11 and also in Android 12. So they were visually redesigned, and this was pretty much part of the material view overhaul, basically. And now you can see that the app icon is going to be shown on the left side of the text. And at the same time, there is another change where the text is going to be limited now only on 2 lines. So keep that in mind, because 2 lines is not going to be the same across all the devices. So if your application, for example, is supporting tablets or normal phone screen sizes, that's not going to be the same. So keep that in mind whenever you want to show a text message, because otherwise the operating system is going to truncate your message. Now, going forward, we have some kind of important changes here, because it's going to impact whoever uses the alarms in their applications. And when I'm speaking about alarms, I'm not talking about the ones waking you up in the morning. I'm actually referring to the alarms from the alarm service classes. So these are basically used whenever an application wants to schedule or perform specific tasks at a specific hour, and the application is not running in that moment. And starting with Android 12, we have some changes on that side, and essentially it is no longer possible to freely set and schedule exact alarms. So exact alarms, I'm actually meaning to scheduling these alarms at a specific time, because usually the operating system can also handle alarms by delaying them or even anticipating them. But there are also ways where you can actually specify that you actually want those alarms to get triggered at a specific time. So this is no longer possible to be set freely from an application now, starting with Android 12. And applications which are using these capabilities, these methods to perform activities at a specific time, they will have to include a specific permission now, which is the schedule exact alarm, and you will have to include it in the Android manifest. This is not going to be a runtime permission. Actually, this is going to be a permission which the user will have to accept it manually from the system settings. So you will have to start the activity with the system settings with a specific action in order for the user to manually accept it. Now, staying on this subject, there was actually another change related to this, which has been introduced in Android 13. And Google, to make it even more complicated, introduced another permission, which is the use exact alarm one. And this permission is going to be limited very much on just a couple of use cases. And at the same time, it's not a runtime permission, and it's not even a manually special capability that the user will have to accept, but instead it's a permission that it's pre-granted by the operating system, typically at the installation process. and obviously cannot be revoked by the user. And among the use cases which this permission has, this includes use cases for applications which are considered as alarm clock applications or timer applications, or any applications which are considered as calendar applications, showing notifications for upcoming events. So this permission, I'm not actually recommending you to use this permission because obviously the first thing is because it's limited only on a couple of use cases, and two, because it's going to be subjected to upcoming Google Play's policies. So there's going to be a Google Play policy for this new permission coming up, and it's going to be like a similar process like for a couple of other special permissions, and you will have to declare and explain to the Google Play team why you are actually using this permission. So it's going to be very difficult for you to get the approval from the Google Play team. So my recommendation is to either use the schedule exact alarm permission, but the users will obviously have to accept it, or you can just use other alternatives such as Work Manager, for example, or you can also use Job Scheduler for scheduling different tasks in the future, for instance, so to be run at a specific time. Now, going to other changes, we had some minor changes to foreground services as well, and essentially in Android 12, it is no longer possible now. Starting from Android 12, it is no longer possible to start and run a new foreground service when the application is in a background state, except in a few special occasions. There is actually a full list of exemptions. I've actually included the link. You can check it out in the developer in the Android developer portal. So whenever your application is going to try to launch a new foreground service and the application is in a background state, and your application is not fulfilling any of the exemptions from the list, the application is going to crash. So the system will throw an exception. And at the same time, from Android 13, there was a minor change related to foreground services, which is about the usage of the notifications. Essentially, by default, notifications are going to be dismissible by default, starting with Android 13, and that includes also the foreground services notifications. So by default, you will no longer have to. So by default, the foreground services will not have persistent notifications anymore. But in case you want to, if you want to keep that in place, just add the set ongoing method while creating the notification with the notification builder inside your code. And another thing to mention about the foreground services related to notifications is related to the new notification permission, because if you're wondering if, for instance, a user if denies this permission, how the foreground services are going to be shown in the notification drawer. So basically in that situation, notifications are not going to be shown at all, because like we said before, whenever a user is denying that permission, no permission is going to be shown in the notification drawer. But at the same time, there is still going to be an evidence of the foreground service running, and that's going to be in the task manager, which we have been talking about earlier. Now, going forward, we have some updates on the app hibernation capability, starting with Android 12. So for those who don't know how app hibernation works, essentially the operating system based on different factors is going to hibernate your application after a specific period of time whenever you are no longer going to use the application or application in general, I mean. And there were some effects of this hibernation, and previously on the older Android versions, the only thing happening after the hibernation, after the hibernation of an application, the runtime permissions were getting reset. And now with Android 12, basically, we have some new other effects happening post hibernation. So not just the runtime permissions are going to be reset, but at the same time, the application will no longer have the ability to run jobs or send alerts from the background. At the same time, the application will no longer have the ability to send notifications of any kind, including also the high fidelity ones. And also any files from the apps cache is going to be removed post hibernation. Now, last thing about the miscellaneous changes is related to some new battery limitations and restrictions, which have been included now with the latest release, so in Android 13. So we have some new updated rules on how the applications are going to be placed in the restricted app standby bucket list. And at the same time, there's going to be an API to check in which bucket list your application is going to be put into. There are also some new limitations on what the application can do in the background whenever your application is going to be put in the restricted bucket list for background battery usage. I don't think it's going to happen to any of your application unless you are mining Bitcoin or something like that on the device, because to get in the restricted bucket list, you have to consume resources at a very high level and for a persistent period of time. And another thing is about some new system notifications to warn the user for excessive battery usage and long-running foreground services. So something similar like the notification which I was talking to you about when we were speaking about the about the task manager for the foreground services. So these new notifications are going to appear if there is like a high usage of resources in the last 24 hours. And when measuring these stats, the system will take in consideration these metrics, which are the foreground services, even those that are that have visible notifications, background services, work tasks, broadcast receivers, and also your apps cache. And that's it from MISC changes. So now let's talk about the little things which have been the little changes actually which have been made to the enterprise side. So just a note here, we didn't have any I mean, there were some changes, but they weren't that very relevant to development itself. And actually most of them are from Android 12, and Android 13 didn't receive any like very particular changes at all. So all these changes which we are going to see now are mainly from Android 12. So starting, we have some changes on the work profile, and now every personal device profile enrollment will have a unique ID, which is going to be called the enrollment specific ID, and essentially this is going to be assigned to the profile enrollment and is not going to change even after many factory resets. So it's like a constant and it's not going to change over time. We now have the ability to set and retrieve profile network logging, and that's going to be only limited on the work profile, obviously. So you're not going to be able to do networking logging on the personal profile. And there was another change related to what the user can now manage in terms of permissions. So the user has the ability now to control a couple of other permissions and even deny them if it is allowed by the IT administrator. And these permissions are the location, the camera, microphone, body sensor, and also physical activity in general. Now, we had some changes also on company owned devices. So an IT administrator now, for instance, can disable USB capabilities of a device, except for the charging function, obviously. Because as you know, the Android device, whenever it's connected to the PC, you can actually choose between the different USB modes. So you can connect it for transfer files. You can also connect it as a media device, or you can just connect it for charging purposes. So now an IT administrator can disable all of them, for example, and just keep the charging function. Now it is also possible to limit the input methods used on a company-owned device by restricting all the system input methods which are not relevant. So, for instance, an IT administrator can just use an only input method for all the company-owned devices and not any different ones. And these two changes are applied since Android 12, and the last one is actually from Android 13, which is related to the provisioning of the company-owned devices. And essentially now an internet connection is going to be required by default whenever you want to provision a new company-owned device. But at the same time, there's still going to be a way to provision devices in an offline environment or in an intranet, for example. But the EMMs will have to include this flag in the provisioning extras in order to keep using this function. So the flag is this one, and it is the extra provisioning allow offline flag. Now, last thing about the Android enterprise related changes, we had some deprecations as well, unfortunately, and these are all mainly from Android 12. Only the last one is from Android 13. So we have the deprecation of a couple of methods and also a couple of actions. So the set password quality and get password quality are now deprecated. So the device policy controllers would have to use the set required password complexity method instead. Then we have the set organization color and the get organization color methods, which are now deprecated. And here we have an important change, actually, an important deprecation, which is related to the action provision manage device action, which has been used for the for any start of operation for provisioning profile. So this action is not going to work anymore starting with Android 12. So if you try to run any provisioning profile with this action, that's going to fail essentially. So instead, you will have to use you will have to use the action get provisioning mode action, and also the action admin policy compliance action for the provisioning. But at the same time, you have to consider that EMMs will still have to use the old way of provisioning for the previous Android version. So you will still have to maintain the retrocompatibility with the deprecated action. Then we had the deprecation of set permission policy and set permission grant state methods, and essentially these ones were used to grant sensor related permissions for the work profiles. And last thing is about the organization logo, which has been used for the provisioning flow. So starting with Android 13, it is no longer possible now to customize the logo while doing the provisioning flow of a new device. And that was pretty much it. So obviously there are some links here. You can follow up. You can follow us on the developer portal. And also we also have some links on LinkedIn and Twitter on our socials. And obviously check out also the Zebra Devs organization, because we have useful examples, sample codes, and projects which you can use for your application as well.
So we'll bring this to a close. If you do have any questions, please save them for the Q&A at the end of the day. So everyone, please navigate over to the next session. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.